Humanities Council. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the invitation to come and talk about something that's very dear to my heart. 2 words. In all my encounters with Holocaust survivors and their families, and that includes survivors who have embraced forgiveness and survivors who have not embraced forgiveness, I always hear the same 2 words: never again. I wish I could assure you today that every student in public, private, or home education in our Commonwealth learns about the violations of human rights and historic events such as the Holocaust or other genocides. The kind of knowledge that makes sure that this never happens again. Unfortunately, in this country, Kentucky is not alone in the fact that Holocaust education is not required. It is not required to even mention the word Holocaust if you go to a public school in Kentucky. And it's unfortunate that we join about 40 other states in this fact. So what does our Commonwealth have? Well, right now we have a watered-down bill that took several years to pass. The Ernie Marks resolution. Ernie was a Holocaust survivor who settled and made his home in Kentucky and fought for Holocaust education, and who died in 2007. So the bill that finally passed in 2008 was named after him. However, it took almost 4 years for this bill to pass, and it kept getting watered down and watered down and watered down. And that was because after interviewing people who were involved in that legislation, at first the legislators did not want to mandate something that was Jewish, since we were a Christian state. And so actually it was a group of some 80 students from a Catholic school in Louisville, 8th graders, that kept pushing this through with their teacher. And so what does the Ernie Marks resolution do? It simply requires that the state of Kentucky must, or excuse me, the Commonwealth of Kentucky must provide Holocaust-related curriculum for any teacher who wants to use it. So that is something. About 10 other states in the Union have that. But here's the situation: the difficult, deep scars of genocide. And some of you may not realize that genocide was not even a word in our vocabulary until after the Holocaust. The word genocide came about because they needed some terminology during the Nuremberg trials. So this idea of genocide and how we need to educate students, historians realized that we really needed to come up with some really guidelines for teachers, because it's not easy to teach something that has such deep scars. And so I'd like to go, before I talk a little bit about the actual bluegrass connection to the Holocaust, I'd like to talk a little bit about just some of the guidelines, because I think it's good for us to be educated as people who talk with others and share, to understand the kind of things we're looking at. The first thing that we have to look at is we have to define the term. Now, if I ask you what is the Holocaust, you would probably have some sort of, well, it was this, mass murder that happened, during World War II that mainly focused on the Jews. But listen to what teachers are supposed to tell the students at the Holocaust, and you'll understand why we have to define this precisely. The Holocaust was the systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of approximately 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. During the era of the Holocaust, German authorities also targeted other groups because of their perceived racial inferiority, such as the Romas, and that is the proper term, not gypsies, the disabled, Slavic peoples such as Polish and Russian people. Other groups that were perceived as political, ideological, and behavioral problems to the Nazis included communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals. I need to point out here how masterful Hitler was at propaganda and defining people, because he used the word inferior race so many times in relationship to the Jewish people that people came to believe that the Jewish people were a race. In fact, when I survey my freshman students at EKU in English, virtually all of them believe that Jewish people are a race. And then I point out to them, well, American people are not a race. And they're very confused. They said, well, we thought they were a race. And so, even explaining to them that the Jewish people are people who share a common culture and or religion is a startling fact for our freshmen in college. So the second thing we have to remember as we talk to students is that we have to strive for precise language. Since the study of the Holocaust at its foundation touches upon all the nuances and tragedies of human behavior, and because it's very complex, it's very easy to generalize and distort facts. And so differences have to be made. And so you can't say things like all Germans, were collaborators, or all concentration camps were killing centers. Because when you start to not be precise in your language, then people start to form wrong ideas. The next thing that I'm going to tell you as a point is something that always shocks people, but it is do not imply the inevitable. So even though a historic event takes place and it's documented in text and in film, that doesn't mean that the event had to happen. And believe it or not, people say, well, it was just inevitable. There's with financial crisis was going on and da-da-da. But this obvious concept is often overlooked by people. The Holocaust took place because individuals, groups, and nations made decisions to act or not to act. Focusing on personal decisions helps us become critical thinkers. And one of the things in teaching the Holocaust to students, we always point out is there's only four types of people. There were the perpetrators, there were the victims, there were the rescuers, and there were the bystanders. And the largest group was the bystanders. And it helps my students when we talk about that, where are you in that category? Hopefully you're not a perpetrator and hopefully you're not a victim. So then comes about, are you a bystander or a rescuer? And it really makes my students and other people think. The next thing when we try to talk about Holocaust education is we avoid simple answers. So the thing is, the Holocaust is full of difficult questions. It's still full of difficult questions. And anytime you simplify the answers, i.e. it was this one man or anything like that, then you don't understand the responsibility of individuals to act or to not act. The next thing we have to remember is my screen thing didn't put my pictures and words together. We have to avoid comparisons of pain. Different policies were carried out by the Nazi regime toward various groups, and we can't assume that the horror of an individual family or community that was destroyed by the Nazis is any greater than any other genocide. Remarks such as the victims of the Holocaust suffered more cruelty than everyone else does not help us to move forward. one of the things I remember is in my freshman English classes, all of my students have to go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum website, and they have to look through and they have to pick a topic for the research paper. And so I had, a couple years ago, one of the basketball players, he comes up to me and he says, this thing about this Rwandan genocide, is this true? And I said, well, yes. And he said, I've never heard of this in my whole life. And I was shocked. He was a black player. And I'll never forget the day that he gave his oral presentation to the class, because everyone has a chance. You know, some people that are in psychology will pick, you know, the psychology of propaganda. People that are in medical may talk about medical experiments. You know, students get to either go explore a new topic or something that they already know. And I'll never forget him standing up in front of the class. Everyone knows he's this basketball player. And he is on the verge of having tears run down his face because he's never heard of the Rwandan genocide. And I still almost cry whenever I tell that little story. The next thing is we have to not romanticize history. And of course, we usually recognize that face. And Anne Frank is a wonderful text, but sometimes students romanticize, oh, we were on a journey, we were hiding in an attic and all of that. And we have to be very careful showing movies such as The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, while, seeming to connect things gives everybody a wrong idea that it was not this sort of adventure that people went on and there were rescuers, because in fact there were few rescuers when you look at the overall statistics. The next thing we have to remember, if we don't romanticize, we have to contextualize. And so if you look at a group of people, for instance the Jewish people, and you always sort of look at them through this lens of the Holocaust, then you're doing them a disservice. You're not remembering all the cultural contributions and activities of 2,000 years of European life before this event happened. And so what happens is if you see them as families and cultures with traditions, then you understand the trauma in which they're virtually wiped out. The final thing is translating statistics into individuals. And this is a key part of the Holocaust, and this is actually why I'm really excited to be talking to you today. It's so easy because I think it's maybe because we're trillions and trillions of dollars into debt and people don't have any idea what numbers mean anymore. And so when you say 6 million Jews, and that doesn't include the other groups, were systematically murdered, that number really doesn't mean anything. But if I said to you that 2/3 of you in this room were wiped out today, that really means a lot more. So I talk to my students in statistical ways that virtually whole villages, whole families, I mean, when you think about it, 2/3 of all the European Jews were wiped out in this one event of history that took such a few years. And so when we talk to students, we try to get them to focus not on statistics, but on individuals such as Sylvia Green. And Sylvia Green is an individual. She's a person just like me. She's a grandparent. She was a parent. At one point, she was a little person, a child. And when we understand that these people are being portrayed in the fullness of their life and not first as victims, we'll understand and really develop empathy. And so what's really exciting is for the next month, you can interact with Sylvia and 8 other Kentucky Holocaust survivors. And there's a special exhibit called This Is Home Now that's at the Giles Gallery. The Giles Gallery is inside the Campbell Building, which is where the Gifford Theater is. And for ease, there's a $1 parking lot. If you're all going like, I don't want to go to campus because there's no parking, I understand your pain, but there is a $1 lot. And I've actually sent Matt a press release about the exhibit that he's going to pass on to you all, and it actually gives the gallery hours. But what is really exciting is this exhibit has been in storage for 12 years. And it exhibited back in 2005, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And recently I received a grant from a foundation in New York City. Actually, the foundation, you've all heard of Sophie's Choice. The woman that inspired that movie left her estate to a board who gives grants out to teachers in America and now across the world to promote Holocaust education. And I received one of those grants, and just through a lot of talking to the art gallery people and tracking down the exhibit, I was able to bring this exhibit back. And it's pretty exciting because it was at the Lexington Historical Museum for a few months back in 2005, but now you have a chance to go in and see and read about Kentucky Holocaust survivors. And if you want to come on this Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, you'll actually hear a Kentucky Holocaust survivor speak. We only have 2 or 3 of them left, and by that I mean that when the Holocaust was over, they actually came to this state and settled. What happened was, when the Holocaust was over, not many European Jews ended up staying in Europe. A few of them did, but not many. The majority of them went to, anybody know, in 1948? Israel. Israel had been created, the majority, but guess what? Our country took in 160,000. That is really a low number. I mean, when you stop to think, that's all we took in from the people who wanted to come to the United States, but we took in 160,000. The majority of those people stayed in New York City, where there was already a vibrant Jewish community to help them. But then a small number went across the Midwest, and about 30 moved to the state of Kentucky, at that point to call Kentucky their home. And so what happened was, back in the 2000s, 2 women, Arwen Donahue and Rebecca Howe, they decided that something needed to be done to treasure the people who came to the Commonwealth. Now, Arwen, had worked for the United States Holocaust Museum, so she had an interest in this. So anyway, she gets her friend Rebecca and a photographer, and they start contacting these 30 people. Only 14 responded. Some of them had serious health issues. Some of them had never told anybody their story and never wanted to talk about it. So Rebecca and Arwen were able to get 14 survivors to talk, and through the process, 9 of them agreed to be part of this exhibit that Arwen and Rebecca opened back in Lexington in 2005. And the response was incredible at that time. But in this process, Arwen started doing oral history interviews with everybody. And she wanted, at that point, she had realized that most Holocaust stories always focused on what happened to you in the Holocaust, which is important. But she wanted to find out what happened to you as a result of the Holocaust that affected how you now had to find a new home, because they had no home anymore. Most of them no family. And so she wanted to know, was your Jewish identity important still in a state like Kentucky? And some of the people had favorable responses, and some of the people didn't have favorable responses. One of the things you learn if you go through and read Arwen's transcripts is this idea of being Jewish was not a religion for most of these people. It was more this ethical code and cultural inheritance for these people, and how they felt that suddenly they were in communities, but because they were labeled Jews and somehow still thought to be an inferior race because of Hitler's propaganda, they were not able to share their cultural inheritance and their ethical code. Think about that. How would you feel if you could not share your cultural inheritance or ethical code? with other people. It would be devastating at the core of your heart. And I think for me, from all my interactions with Texan people, I understand that any group of people who live in our community, their history is just not about them, it's about us. And it's just not about then, but it's about now. Anyway, like I said, Arwen and Rebecca gathered enough materials to put on this exhibit, and this exhibit is now back at Eastern. A little backstory. As I told you, by 1945, most of the European Jews, 2 out of every 3, had been exterminated. And then, as I said, most of the surviving European Jewry came to either Israel or the United States. And like I said, 30 of them settled in Kentucky. One of these people today that I'm going to talk about is Sylvia. And just take a second and look at her. I think she's beautiful. And my path actually crossed with Sylvia back in September of 1944. She was working as a volunteer at the Clark Regional Hospital. Remember, I'm from Winchester, and I had just given birth to a wonderful baby girl. Here's the thing. In my interaction with her, she never told me that she was a Holocaust survivor, but then she never even told her own children that she was a Holocaust survivor. They didn't figure it out until they were adults. And they never talked about it in the family. And in a minute, I'll tell you how they finally hear her story. So this journey for Sylvia to come to Kentucky was filled with humiliation, danger, and tragedy. She not only had her physical home ripped away, but she said a permanent goodbye to almost all of her immediate family. She was 15 years old in October of 1938 when her father was forced to leave Germany and return to Poland, where he was born. The following month was the rampage known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of the Broken Glass. Right after that, Sylvia remembers that they have a mandatory meeting for the wives of Polish Jewish citizens. Sylvia's mother is sick, so she sends Sylvia in her place. When Mrs. Farber's name is called, Sylvia stands up and explains why she came in her mother's place. One of the Nazi soldiers gets angry. He gives her a pencil and makes her sign some sort of statement. She's so terrified, but maybe that's, not so shocking since he has a gun held to her temple. She never really got over it. In the 50s, when she finally decided to become a United States citizen and she needed to get a Social Security number, she tells it she waits 3 hours in the parking lot before she can get up enough nerve to walk into a government office. Sylvia recalls that her mother kept saying over and over, "This can't get any worse, this can't get any worse." But it did, and Sylvia and her mother were forced to pack up their belongings and actually go to Poland. Now, before this happened, the officials came to Sylvia's mother, and it was sort of one of those Sophie Choice situations. They said, you can only send one child to a safe location, to this boarding school in England. Do you want to send Bernard or Sylvia? And of course, her mother thinks that it's going to be safer if the brother goes, that somehow they won't do anything to the young ladies. And so she sends Bernard. And so Sylvia is left to go through the Holocaust. The mother, Sylvia, and her mom are forced to go to a ghetto in Poland. And this idea that they might link up with the father is short-lived because someone finds a man dead on the streets, beaten up, and he's clutching a picture of Sylvia and her mother. And so they realize that that's Sylvia's dad. They're soon in the ghetto, and Sylvia becomes separated from her mother, and she never knew what happened to her mother. Finally, they have liberation from Auschwitz in 1945, but where is Sylvia going to go? She didn't even know if her brother had survived the war. But one thing her mother had drilled into them: there was distant relatives, the Leon Urbach family in Lexington, Kentucky, and if you needed help, write to them. So Sylvia doesn't know how to write or speak English, so she asked a British soldier She writes down the name, and she somehow manages through a translator to say, will you send a letter to this family and tell them, will you send, I know, it is a climatic part of the story. Good for you, you're listening. Ask them to send a letter. I thought, wow, the power of a letter. He does that. What if that British soldier had never sent that letter? Boy, does that remind us to take care of our commitments. When we tell people we're going to make a phone call or do something, we have to follow through. Every time I tell this story, I'm reminded of those tiny commitments we must do. Anyway, he sends the letter, and the Leon Yerbach family in Lexington get it, and they immediately contact Bernard, who's living in another city in Kentucky, and tell him, guess what? Your sister is alive. Well, I mean, he's just overjoyed. And he ends up going back to Poland to pick up Sylvia to bring her to the United States. And so that's why one of the reasons was she was able to come in the United States, because when Bernard went to Britain and they realized that he could speak 7 languages, he immediately was drafted into Army intelligence. Okay, and so he worked for the war. So he had a secure position here. So he had that passport to bring Sylvia into the country. And so, of course, when they came here, Sylvia immediately fell in love with New York City, the life, the excitement, the Jewish population, all of that. But Bernard said, no, we are going back to Lexington. You will love Kentucky. And so they came here, and it was a little bit coming into Kentucky at first, and so the Yerbachs, of course, wanted the brother and sister to stay with them, but no, they wanted their independence. And even though Bernard didn't do too bad, Sylvia worked all sorts of jobs, trying to earn enough money because, they wanted their independence. They wanted their own place. And so in the process of working, Sylvia meets a man named Jake Green who lives in Winchester, and they fall in love. And of course, Bernard is not too sure about this, even though Jake is a Jew. He hasn't been through the Holocaust. And Holocaust Jews look at themselves as a minority within a minority. And he wasn't too sure, but finally they prove that true love will win out, and he gives in, and he jokes, he says, I'm not losing a sister, I'm gaining a bathroom. And so, I know, we laugh at this, but Bernard says, no, I am serious. Because see, one of the things was after the war, Sylvia struggled, as other Holocaust survivors, with always feeling dirty. They had lived with constant lice, and the idea of having access to a bathroom and clean water was unbelievable. And so it was not uncommon to read about Holocaust survivors taking 3 or 4 showers and baths a day, just because they couldn't get over the fact that they could actually do it. So he really was gaining a bathroom. Despite her love and marriage to Jake, Sylvia did not share much of her past with Jake until she became pregnant. And that's when the nightmares began. Sylvia would dream that the Germans were coming to take away her baby. She had seen in the past how they would destroy Jewish babies by throwing them against the wall because they didn't want to, quote, waste bullets. After their son was born, Sylvia's nightmares tapered off. She and Jake had another child about 4 years later, a daughter, and all of this is happening in Winchester. And then, of course, as I told you before, in 1952, Sylvia becomes an American citizen. But even becoming an American citizen, that actual day, that process was not without pain. Sylvia was called up in front of the Kentucky judge, who evidently was just scanning through the request, not looking carefully, and he says, I notice here you were incarcerated. What were you incarcerated for? I know. Sylvia just started crying, and she said, the only crime I ever committed was I was born to Jewish parents. And then the judge whispers, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Sylvia, so as I told you, she hadn't told her children, and her experiences did not come public until 1983. She'd lived in Kentucky for 40 years at that point, and now her experience has become public. And it's because in 1981, a history teacher at Tate's Creek High School in Lexington taught that the Holocaust most likely never happened. Yeah, this incident of Holocaust denial ripped across the community, and the teacher was told, stick to the textbook. Well, of course, the textbook doesn't even mention the Holocaust, but he's told, stick to the textbook. It's funny, I've talked to Arwen about this because she actually did research when she's trying to put this exhibit together, and somehow, eventually, the records are lost somehow in the Fayette County system. So, he works for about another year or two because there's actually parents whose children like this teacher. And so the bottom line is, but it's in 1981 that suddenly this comes to the forefront in the state of Kentucky. We have a teacher that's teaching that the Holocaust didn't exist. And in other schools, the Holocaust is never even mentioned. You would be shocked if I would say 30% of my students do not know about the Holocaust coming into my classrooms at EKU. They have no idea. If they do, they're like, oh yeah, that's that Schindler's List movie, isn't it? Okay? That's their context, is some sort of Hollywood movie. And I'm not saying that Schindler's List was not, because Oskar Schindler was a wonderful rescuer. But I'm saying that is just such a minute part of what's going on when we talk about the Holocaust. So anyway, what happened was, when this instance of Holocaust denial, it was like throwing water into the faces of these Holocaust survivors in Kentucky. So about a dozen of the 30 people started to speak. And there was such a shockwave that they made a KET documentary with Dr. Otis Singletary from UK. And he moderated a panel of 3 survivors and 2 liberators. And this, at that time, I haven't been able to see this. I've tried to find a copy of this, but it's buried somewhere and it probably hasn't been digitalized, etc. But anyway, Sylvia was on that panel. And so when she told that story and her children watched the TV documentary, that was the first time they'd ever heard their mother mention the word Holocaust when they saw that. And so again, Sylvia never made a big deal out of being Jewish, because again, Hitler had done such a great job at propaganda of this inferior race, and somehow that they felt like they somehow deserved this. And even though Sylvia knew none of this was true, she had heard it so much and everybody else had talked about this so much, she began to feel this. And another thing is, she really didn't want her children to stand out. Unfortunately, a teacher in Winchester did make sure that Sylvia's daughter stood out. One day, this teacher announced to all the children that she had driven up and down Boone Avenue, which is a beautiful street in Winchester of historic homes, and all the houses were decorated so beautifully for Christmas. All except one, the greenhouse. Let's take up a collection to help them. I know. Their daughter was devastated. So when this happened, Sylvia and some of the others had started speaking out, and that's when Arwen decided, hey, somebody needs to start recording these histories, these oral histories, and have a slight different focus. Not that we don't talk about what happened, but what happens now? What happens now when you can't share your ethical code or your cultural identity? What happens when you're trying to make home in a new place? And so, like I said, Arwen was able to do this project, have the exhibit with panels in which you see larger-than-life pictures of the various survivors, word text, beautiful words. And then, of course, in 2009, University of Kentucky Press went ahead and put her oral transcripts, so this is like a Q&A book, put her oral transcripts together in this book, which is the same name as the exhibit, This Is Home Now. And so I wish I could tell you that Sylvia was one of our people that was going to come and talk. Actually, John Rosenberg who has done a lot of civil rights cases free for people in the state of Kentucky. He's our Kentucky Holocaust survivor that's coming to speak on Wednesday night. But the exhibit is open for a month. It's free. You know, anybody is allowed to come. If you want to make tour group reservations, etc., that press release tells you all the details that I don't want to stand up here and tell you, because it has numbers and everything for you. But I encourage you to at least take an opportunity to come and connect with these people. Jake died, and after he died, Sylvia never felt like she had the strength to continue to go into classrooms and civic groups and talk, because she said it was like every time she'd tell the story, it was reliving it over. And when she lost her husband, she just couldn't feel like she could do it anymore. And then a year or so ago, she moved to Chattanooga because she needed more care because of aging issues. And she died this January in Chattanooga, surrounded by her family. But like I said, we all know what that word home means. I might contend that it might be the most important word in the world, home, and what that means. And if you didn't have a good home, dreams of wanting that kind of home, you know, it's just one of those beautiful words. And so to think that these people came here and started a new life teaches us so many lessons. And so again, I thank you for allowing me to share one of my educational passions, but actually one of my philosophical and emotional passions in life about, you know, learning and understanding the dignity of all people and their ethic codes and their cultural richness. And I hope you have a chance to come and see This Is Home Now in Easter, or at Richmond, or here, sorry. I get emotional thinking about all this. Anyway, thank you very much for allowing me to share. Questions? I'll try to answer them the best I can.
Well, I think one thing that I'm Jewish, so but lately the problems we've had in our country, in Charlottesville, running up and down the street, I thought, you know, it's Kristallnacht, deja vu, and nobody's like doing. I mean, you know, a few people out on the street protesting. Nobody, and you look again, Puerto Rico, you know, Southern Florida is taken care of. You know, they've got dehumidifiers in their houses and everything. But the brown people and black people who live in Puerto Rico are, you know, their mayor is standing on the TV, and I mean, you go, girl. She, you know, crudely put, ripped him a new one, the president. And, you know, so here we are again. It's the same old thing. You know, never again. Well, that lasted about 10 minutes. And before that, we had the Armenians. Let's see, certainly in my lifetime, besides the Holocaust, we had the Bosnian Muslim men. In Burma, the good, patient, Buddhist, you know, what are they doing? They're killing their Muslim minority. So, I mean, really, what have we learned? We've learned a lot, that it's okay to kill people you don't like because nobody will do anything.
And that's, you know, as a teacher, you know, I was an English teacher, you know, teaching writing. And I thought, what good is writing if you can't write something to change the world? And so a student of mine introduced me to another teacher who was a Holocaust educator. And I'd never thought about, you know, as a college English teacher, but I got involved in it, and I started going through training. And so even though I'm teaching English, we're writing papers about human rights issues, and we're looking at history and what do we learn from history. And I know what you're saying, and all I can say is every time I do that, are you a perpetrator, a victim, a bystander, a rescuer? And I can convince somebody that most of you in this classroom are bystanders, and you cannot be a bystander. There's a wonderful poem I will share real quick. You will appreciate this poem. First they came for the Jews by Martin Niemöller. First they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. So I understand your pain. It's, that's why I like to, this is not a usual talk in the Kentucky Humanities Council, and I'm grateful that when I proposed it to them, they understood the need. And like last spring, I spoke to 1,000 students in high schools, and it encouraged the librarian to go in and totally redo the whole bookshelf area, and it started a whole thing. So all we can do is start conversations, and that's why I sort of gave that opening introduction that's sort of like what a teacher would get, because I think when I first learned the definition of the Holocaust as a systematic, bureaucratic, state-sponsored, when I realized that and I said yes, it gives people that understanding of you must stand up for your rights, you must vote, you must do things. Because I would have never defined, I probably would have thrown Hitler's name in there, but what happens is we take away individual choices. When we start focusing, I mean, I understand your frustration about people, but we have to start focusing on individuals, It's difficult. Yes.
I don't know how recent the research is, but there has been research done, I do believe, on the children of Holocaust victims, and how, in fact, it's interesting that Sylvia's children didn't know until they were adults. And the question in my mind is, because some of the children of Holocaust victims behave as if they were the victims themselves, and so is it, this is rhetorical, is it best for them not to know until they become adults, or should they know when they're younger? To me, it's quite a conundrum in terms of that.
Yeah, and it is. If any of you have a chance, has anybody here seen the special on PBS called Sharp's War, Defying the Nazis? You have to see it. It is about one of the most phenomenal Unitarian pastors, American pastors. It's about he and his wife. And he actually, it's an incredible. So when I was in New York City on my study thing with the Holocaust, the man he had been trying for 10 years to get this documentary produced about his grandparents. One day he's at a party with a man named Ken Burns. Yeah, well, and Ken Burns just happened to convince Tom Hanks to do this project free. So, but it comes on in cycles, but it is about a Unitarian American couple who the Unitarian Church says, we can't sit here and not do anything. We have to do, and so they sent this couple over, and they actually rescued children out of the Holocaust. I mean, it grips you. I mean, to watch this true documentary, but that's it. It starts with people saying we will do something, whatever is put into our mind to do, and everyone has different things. You may be. You may have an emphasis as long, human rights wise, I think everybody is given a different love for different groups. I mean, we love everybody, but I think some people are more interested. You know, I have some of my students who really got into the Rwandan genocide. Well, I'm all for that. You know, my area of study is more the Holocaust because we all can't be experts on every single aspect. And I think all of us feel this tugging, if we're honest, to do something for someone. And, you know, you have to decide who that's going to be. But going back to that whole thing about the children, so he talks about that because it was his, even though he was the American, he did not know until he was an adult that his grandparents had been involved in rescuing. They, as rescuers, did not tell the story to the grandkids. And I think, and then I've actually met some Holocaust children. And recently I met a granddaughter from a Holocaust victim of Kansas. I think most of them wish they had known earlier, especially nowadays with us having a more open atmosphere with social media and kids knowing things at younger ages, things that we wouldn't even have thought to tell kids basically. And so I think the psychiatrists and psychologists are discovering that there's certain levels you can go, and there's terminology to use, but it's best to tell students and not keep them in the dark about it's sort of like people debating about the adoption. At what point do you tell? But if it's just part of your cultural history, you know, I've heard psychiatrists talk about, you know, having a family photo, you know, on there, black and white, and well, what is that? Well, this is before the Holocaust happened, you know, when grandmother was alive or something, and just putting it into this context of the family. But I think most children now, they're saying, need to know sooner and not wait till, oh my goodness, I'm 30 years old and I found out my mother was in the Holocaust. And there's a wild story in this about a woman who didn't tell anybody, her children, her grandchildren, and she always wore long sleeve shirts to cover up the number. Now, some of the Kentucky Holocaust survivors, a couple of them actually had the number removed, and that's a whole nother whether people decide to remove their number or not. But one day, they talk about in the book, one day she's rolled up her sleeves and the grandchildren say, "Granny, what is that number on your arm?" And she's horrified and she just pulls it down. She said, "Oh, you know, Granny, she's so forgetful. It's my telephone number." So again, there's just so much, you know, my emphasis is sort of like in teaching teachers, how do you go into a classroom and start to talk about this subject? How do you define terms with students? How do you have to be careful not to generalize? How important is it to talk about cultural inheritance and code of ethics? Because, you know, when you talk to most people, even the people that we call the current government problems, they have cultural inheritance and a code of ethics. And I think we forget those two simple things. Plus, we forget that the Holocaust was not inevitable. You know, it was choices that people made. And that is a strong thing that when I go and I talk to other teachers on what's the language you use in the classroom, don't let everybody say, "Oh, well, they were in financial crisis, blah, 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 blah. They had, you know," no. People made choices and bystanders. And of course, is there going to be, if things are terrible, are there going to be loss of life? You know, if you take a stand, yeah. But you can't watch Saving Private Ryan or any of those movies and not talk about what happens to frontline people. It's horrible. War is horrible. I don't, I always feel a little intimidated talking about this because I don't have any answers for any of you other than I'm trying to share my heart with people about how we have to love everybody's cultural backgrounds and code of ethics, you know. So like I said, I always feel intimidated talking about this subject. Yes.
As a psychiatrist, I was just going to say something about the telling children versus not telling children. I think the problem is if you don't tell the children, they actually know something. what it is that they know is confusing to them, they can tell by the way the parent is acting that something is wrong. And when you don't talk about it, then they get confused about what's going on.
Oh, perfect answer. Thank you. I'll use that because people do ask. And like I said, there's a lot of literature, but the literature is always saying talk to the kids now.
There's a topic of what's it called, transgenerational trauma, and
Right.
there really is it really actually gets transmitted.
Oh, it does. And I've had students actually end up writing about that as a part of, a paper. What I love, and I've tried to encourage other teachers because you wouldn't believe how much students say, oh, I didn't know this, or I didn't know that, or oh, I'd seen some Holocaust movies. And then they start researching, and like I said, I let them pick anything that they want to. And one of the things I love about, though, talking about the Holocaust, it makes students who think they are on this side of how they feel about things, like, maybe not really a good side, when they hear about the Holocaust and how we had a ship with, 600 people, and because Cuba said they were going to take them in. And then the U.S., they ask for mercy, and we turn them away in World War II, and they go back, and almost all of them are killed, and I can't think of the name of the ship off the top of my head. St. Louis. Yes, thank you. St. Louis. People are like going, you're kidding, we didn't take those 600 people in? No.
What was the word you said that didn't exist? It wasn't Holocaust.
Oh, genocide. And my students are always shocked about that. They said genocide, and it's like, yes, that word, was coined when the Nuremberg trials came about so it's a modern word. Now they've gone back and used the word for other incidences, even with American Indians and stuff. But at the time, nobody named it, and they felt that when the Nuremberg trials happened, they needed a precise term. And so that's the word came, and now they've looked back and applied it to other things. But at that point, we just used mass murder or whatever. They didn't have a consistent historical term for it. Any other questions? And the music was marvelous. Thank you. I felt like we could have all gotten up and had dancing or something with the Jewish cultural heritage. And that one hymn, it had that Jewish sort of melodic tone. The music was marvelous today. Thank you so very much. Thank you again. I'm going to leave a few postcards up here if anybody wants to take a postcard or wants to send it, to a friend to come to the exhibit. And then, like I said, Matt said he'd make sure that you get all. I just didn't want to give you names and numbers, and then you're writing on the back of a envelope bill, and if you're like me, you've lost the envelope bill. So. Anyway, I'm just going to leave these up here. Thank you again.